Jessamine Denton stood at the church door in a borrowed gray dress, forced to marry a cowboy she had never met, while the whole town watched to see if she would break. Her left shoe had split at the toe, and the white ribbon around her wrist was not bridal silk, but a strip torn from her mother's old curtain. Behind her, Mr. Pike whispered that Dad had finally taught the Denton girl obedience. Ahead of her, Marshal Irons waited beside the preacher, broad-shouldered, dust on his coat, a stranger with iron-gray eyes and a small cedar box in his hands. When the vows ended, he did not kiss her. He opened the box and gave her a wedding gift that made every mouth in the church fall silent. Before the dust rises, write your country in the comments so I know where this story found you. If you enjoy lonely cowboys, brave women, and love that heals old wounds, subscribe for the next tale. The bell above Mercy Creek Church rang once, though no one had touched the rope. A hard prairie wind had slipped under the eaves and moved the old iron clapper by itself, sending one lonely note across the packed room. Women in stiff Sunday collars turned their heads. Men shifted their boots against the plank floor. Children leaned around their mothers' skirts to stare at Jessamine Denton, as if she were not a bride, but a sentence being carried out. She stood in the aisle with her hands folded so tightly, her knuckles had gone pale. The cracked toe of her left shoe showed beneath the hem of the gray dress. She tried to hide it by turning her foot inward, but the movement only made Mrs. Elspeth Vale whisper louder. Look there, not even proper shoes for her own wedding. It was not her own wedding. That was the first truth Jessamine held inside herself. It had begun 3 weeks earlier with a paper signed by a dead father, an unpaid debt, and a threat from Clayton Pike, the rival rancher who owned half the water rights east of town. Pike had arrived at the Denton boarding room with 2 men behind him and a ledger under his arm. Jessamine's father had borrowed against the old homestead before it burned. Interest had grown like thistles. If she did not marry a man willing to assume the debt, Pike said, he would have the sheriff place her in service at his ranch until the sum was worked off. No woman came back from Pike's ranch with her head held high. The preacher had called the arrangement unfortunate but lawful. Her aunt had called it mercy. The town had called it a solution. Jessamine had called it a cage. And the man waiting at the altar was the lock. Marshal Irons stood beside Reverend Bell with his hat in one hand and a cedar box in the other. Jessamine had never seen him before that morning. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone had. He owned the North Range beyond Stony Draw, kept to himself, worked like a hired hand though he had acres enough to employ 20 men, and was known for paying cash, speaking little, and carrying grief in his eyes like a winter brand. He had not sent flowers. He had not written a letter. He had merely agreed. That was what hurt most. Jessamine took one step, then another. The aisle seemed longer than a cattle trail. Her Aunt Lyda walked behind her with one hand pressed between Jessamine's shoulders, not guiding so much as making certain she did not turn and run. At the front pew, Clayton Pike smiled. He was dressed too well for church, in a dark coat with silver buttons and a pearl stickpin that caught the light whenever he moved. His mustache was trimmed sharp. His eyes were dull with victory. "That makes fine brides," he murmured as she passed. Jessamine did not look at him. She fixed her gaze on the cedar box in Marshall's hand. It was plain, no larger than a Bible, tied with rawhide instead of ribbon. A strange wedding gift, if it was a gift at all. Perhaps a ring lay inside. Perhaps a receipt. Perhaps the first command of her new life. Reverend Bell cleared his throat. His voice shook a little. "We are gathered under the eyes of God to join Marshal Irons and Jessamine Denton in lawful marriage." Lawful, not joyful, not willing, lawful. The vows came like cold water. Marshall's voice was low and rough, each word measured. He did not look proud. He did not look pleased. Once, when the preacher asked Jessamine if she took this man, her throat closed around the answer. The whole church leaned forward, and Lyda's fingers dug into her back. "I do," Jessamine whispered. Marshall's jaw tightened as if the words had struck him. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife. No one clapped. Jessamine braced herself for the kiss. She feared it more than she feared the gossip, more than Pike's smile, more than the unknown road north. But Marshal Irons did not touch her. He stepped back half a pace, set his hand on the altar rail, and lifted the cedar box between them. "This is yours," he said. His words were not soft enough to be tender, but they were steady enough to be heard in every pew. Jessamine stared at the box. Your wedding gift." A ripple went through the church. Mrs. Vale craned her neck. Clayton Pike's smile widened, expecting jewels he could mock or some rancher's trinket that would prove Jessamine had been bought cheap. Marshall untied the rawhide and opened the lid. Inside lay no necklace, no ring, no lace. There were folded papers, a brass key, and a small blue ribbon faded almost white. Jessamine knew that ribbon. Her mother had once worn it around her hymn book. Marshall took out the top paper and handed it to Reverend Bell. "Read it," he said. The preacher frowned. "Mr. Irons, this is hardly." "Read it aloud." The church held its breath. Reverend Bell adjusted his spectacles. His face changed before his voice did. "This document declares the full settlement of the Denton debt, including principal and interest paid in lawful coin by Marshal Irons." Clayton Pike stood so fast the pew scraped the floor. Marshall did not look at him. Second paper. The preacher's fingers trembled. Deed of transfer, returning the Denton homestead parcel, including the east pasture, orchard ground, and springhouse lot, to Jessamine Denton. A gasp broke from the women's side of the church. "In her own name," Reverend Bell finished. Jessamine could not breathe. Her father's land, the burned place where her mother had planted apple trees, the springhouse where Jessamine had cooled jars of cream as a girl, land everyone said was lost forever beneath debt and ashes. Marshall reached into the box again and drew out the brass key. "This opens the new door on that land," he said. "I had an end frame, a cabin there. Not much yet. 4 walls, a roof, a stovepipe. It belongs to you." The church went silent in a way Jessamine had never heard before. Not the silence of prayer, not the silence of shame, the silence of people watching their own judgment fall apart. Marshall took out one last paper. "And this," he said, "is a petition for annulment, signed by me, to be filed after winter. If Mrs. Irons wishes it, no man here will say she was trapped by me." The cedar box seemed to tilt in Jessamine's vision. Debt paid, land restored, a key, a way out, a wedding gift that was not a claim but a door. Clayton Pike's face darkened. "That debt was not yours to settle. It was held in your ledger," Marshall said. "You took my coin yesterday, under protest. You took it." Pike's eyes cut toward Jessamine. "Careful, girl. Paper burns easy on the prairie." Marshall closed the cedar box with one hand. "Then keep your matches away from my wife's land." My wife. Jessamine should have hated the sound. Instead, it struck the room like a shield raised between her and Pike. She looked at Marshall for the first time, as more than a stranger. Dust lay along his collar. A healing cut marked one cheek. His hands were broad and scarred, yet he held the little blue ribbon as gently as if it were a bird's wing. "Why?" she asked, so quietly, only he and the preacher could hear. Marshall's eyes lowered to the cracked toe of her shoe, then rose to her face. "Because being forced should not be the last word of a woman's life," he said. The ride to the Irons Ranch was not the rescue Jessamine had imagined in secret when she was young enough to believe rescues came with music. There was no carriage draped in flowers, no hand reaching for hers. No sweet promise murmured over the sound of hoofbeats. There was only Marshall driving a buckboard through dry wind, Jessamine sitting stiff beside him with the cedar box in her lap, and the town shrinking behind them like a bad dream that still knew her name. A brown mare was tied behind the wagon. Jessamine's trunk sat in the back, light enough to shame her. 2 dresses, a hairbrush, her mother's Bible, and a tin of buttons. A life reduced to things that did not rattle much. Marshall kept both hands on the reins. "You'll have the west room," he said, after a mile. Jessamine turned. "At your ranch. For now," she repeated. He glanced at her, then back at the road. Your cabin is framed, not finished. Roof is sound. Floor is down. No chinking yet. Stove not set. Winter comes hard north of here. I did not ask you to build me a cabin. No, I did not ask you to pay that debt. No, I did not ask you to marry me either. His hands tightened slightly. No, ma'am. That ma'am placed a distance between them wider than the prairie. Jessamine looked down at the cedar box. Then, why do all this? Marshall was quiet so long she thought he would not answer. My sister was made to marry a man she feared, he said at last. Folks called it settlement, called it sense, called it better than scandal. She lived 11 months after. The wind seemed to lose sound. Jessamine turned her face toward him, but Marshall's eyes stayed on the horses. I could not stop it then, he said. I was young, poor, mean with anger and useless with it. I can stop one now. The answer should have softened her. Instead, it frightened her in a new way. So I am not a wife, she said. I am an old grief you found standing in church. The words hurt as soon as they left her mouth, but Marshall did not defend himself. My bay, he said. That honesty cut more deeply than a lie. They rode the next miles in silence. The Irons Ranch came into view near sundown, spread low and plain beneath a purple sky. A weathered house leaned into a windbreak of cottonwoods. Barns stood beyond it, dark red paint peeling from the boards. Smoke rose from a chimney. Cattle dotted the far slope like black stones in yellow grass. A hired man came from the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers. He was older, with a white beard and a limp. This her? He asked. Marshall's voice sharpened. This is Mrs. Irons. You'll call her that until she asks otherwise. The man removed his hat at once. Beg pardon. Name's Amos Creed. I keep things from falling down when the boss forgets houses. Need tending same as fences. Jessamine nodded, unsure whether to smile. Inside, the house smelled of coffee, wood smoke, leather, and old loneliness. It was clean in the way a man cleanses when he does not know what to do with corners. The table had 2 chairs though. Only one looked used. A blue shawl hung by the stove, faded and folded over a peg. Marshall saw her looking. My mother's, he said. You may use it if you're cold. I have my own shawl, coarse. It held a bed, a washstand, a small braided rug, and curtains that looked newly hung. On the pillow lay a pair of women's boots. Jessamine stared at them. Marshall shifted behind her. Your aunt said your shoes were worn through. I guessed the size. If they don't fit, I'll send for another. Her pride rose hot. You have been speaking with my aunt about my feet. No, about what you needed. I needed not to be discussed like a milk cow. He flinched then, just barely, but enough for her to see. You're right, he said. I handled it poorly. That was the first time Jessamine had heard a man admit fault without being forced to it. Still, she picked up the boots and set them on the floor instead of thanking him. Supper was beans, bread, and salt pork Amos had left warming. Marshall served her first, then took his plate to the far end of the table. He did not ask her to pour his coffee. He did not speak of marriage. He did not look at the bed down the hall. After supper, Jessamine found him outside on the porch, holding the annulment paper. You meant this? She asked from the doorway. He turned. Lantern light cut half his face in gold and half in shadow. Yes, after winter, roads close when the snow comes, court sits in March, and until then, you're safe here. Safe is not the same as free. No, he said. It isn't. A coyote cried somewhere beyond the cottonwoods. Jessamine stepped onto the porch, wrapping her arms around herself. I thought about running at the train station. I know. You knew. You looked at the southbound tracks, like a thirsty woman looks at a well. Why didn't you stop me? Marshall looked across the dark yard. Train left before the vows ended. Next one won't come through till Thursday. If you choose it then, I'll drive you. Jessamine laughed once, bitter and small. And where would I go? His mouth tightened. That's the part men forget when they talk of choice. She wanted to hate him. It would have been easier, but hatred needed certainty, and Marshall Irons kept ruining certainty by being neither cruel enough to fear nor kind enough to trust. That night, Jessamine sat on the edge of the West Room bed, in her borrowed dress, and unlaced her cracked shoes. The new boots waited by the washstand. She did not put them on, not yet. The first snow came early, thin as flour, sifted over the yard. By then Jessamine had been at the Irons Ranch 11 days, long enough to learn which floorboard groaned outside Marshall's room, which stove lid smoked if set crooked, and how the wind sounded different when it came from the north. Long enough, too, for Mercy Creek to decide she had bewitched him. Mrs. Vale said Marshall had lost his senses. Clayton Pike said Jessamine had planned the debt from the start and landed herself a rich fool. The church ladies sent no casseroles, no visiting baskets, no wedding quilt. Their silence arrived by the road each morning like another kind of weather. Jessamine told herself she did not care. Then she found Marshall mending her split shoe by lamplight. It was near midnight. She had come to the kitchen for water and stopped in the doorway. He sat at the table with the old shoe in his large hands, pushing a curved needle through the leather with patient care. The new boots sat beside him. "I didn't mean to pry," he said without looking up. "That shoe was in my room, under the chair, so near off. Thought you might want it kept. I have the boots. You haven't worn them." Jessamine crossed the kitchen and took the shoe from him. "Because every time I put on something you bought, the town wins its argument." He rested the needle on the table. "What argument?" "I was purchased." Marshall leaned back, tiredness passing over his face. "Jessamine, I bought debt, not you." It was the first time he had spoken her name. She felt it, though she wished she had not. "My father used to mend our shoes," she said, looking at the crooked stitches Marshall had made after Mother died. He was bad at it too. A faint breath that might have been a laugh moved through him. "I am bad at many domestic arts. You make terrible coffee. That one I know. And you fold towels as if punishing them." Hadn't been told towels had feelings. She almost smiled. Almost. The next morning she wore the boots. Amos noticed first and wisely said nothing. Marshall noticed second and looked away too quickly. That pleased Jessamine more than praise would have. Days gathered into small habits. Marshall rose before dawn. Jessamine learned to bake biscuits in the iron stove, burning only the first batch badly enough for Amos to call them defensive weapons. She took over the kitchen, not because Marshall asked, but because the room had been waiting for a human heart. She scrubbed the windows, shook dust from curtains, and moved the blue shawl from its lonely peg to the back of a chair, where someone might actually use it. One bitter afternoon, a calf got caught in a wire break near the creek. Marshall came back with blood on his sleeve and snow in his hair, carrying the shivering animal across his shoulders. Jessamine met him at the barn with towels and hot water. "You'll ruin your dress," he said. "It is already ruined by being gray." He set the calf down on straw. Together, they worked without speaking much. Marshall held the animal steady, while Jessamine cleaned the torn flesh. Her fingers were gentle and sure. "You done this before?" he asked. "My father kept milk cows. One was more trouble than all the sinners in Mercy Creek. That many more this time." Marshall smiled, and it changed his face so suddenly, Jessamine had to look down. The calf lived. 2 days later, Marshall drove her to town for flour, lamp oil, and nails. Jessamine sat beside him wearing the boots and her mother's blue ribbon tucked at her collar. When they passed the church, 3 women stopped talking. At the Mercantile, Mr. Cobb greeted Marshall and ignored Jessamine until Marshall placed a list on the counter. "Mrs. Irons keeps the house accounts now," he said. "You'll speak to her." Mr. Cobb blinked. Of course. Jessamine felt every eye in the store. She ordered flour, coffee, beans, salt, needles, thread, and a small packet of cinnamon she did not need but wanted, because the kitchen had begun to feel like a place where sweetness might belong. When Cobb looked to Marshall for approval, Marshall looked at Jessamine. "Anything else?" he asked. That small question carried more respect than any compliment she had ever been given. At the church steps, Reverend Bell intercepted them. "Mrs. Irons," he said, uncomfortable under his own hat. "The Ladies' Aid meets Thursdays. Some have wondered whether your presence might create discussion." Jessamine understood. They wondered whether shame is catching. The Reverend flushed. "That is not how I would phrase it." Marshall stepped down from the wagon. Jessamine touched his sleeve before he could speak. Not because she forgave the insult, but because she wanted to answer it herself. "Tell them I will not come Thursday," she said. "Not because I am ashamed, because I have work worth doing." She climbed into the wagon before her hands could tremble. On the ride home, Marshall said, "You stood straight." "I was sitting. You know what I mean." She looked at the road ahead. "Standing straight is easier when someone is not pressing a hand into your back." He absorbed that without reply. That evening, Jessamine found a small shelf newly fixed beside the kitchen window. Her mother's Bible sat there, which Marshall must have taken from her trunk and placed with care. Beside it lay the packet of cinnamon. He had not said a word. She made apple biscuits from dry slices Amos found in the storage barrel. The smell filled the house. When Marshall came in from the barn, he stopped as if the warmth had struck him. "Been a long time since this house smelled like that," he said. "Like apples, like somebody stayed." Jessamine turned away to hide what those words did to her. That night, she put the cedar box on the shelf under her mother's Bible. Debt, receipt, deed, key, annulment petition. A wedding gift that still frightened her because it offered freedom. And freedom meant she would one day have to decide what her heart wanted when fear was no longer deciding for her. Clayton Pike returned to the story on a Sunday morning, carrying roses. They were red, costly, and wrong for winter. He stood outside Mercy Creek Church while bells called the town in, holding the flowers as if the whole scene had been arranged for his amusement. Snow lay in gray ridges along the street. Horses stamped and steamed. Jessamine stepped down from the wagon, and Pike swept off his hat. "Mrs. Irons," he said, though I still stumble over the name. Marshall came around the team, but Jessamine spoke first. "Then practice in private." A few men near the hitching rail chuckled. Pike's eyes hardened. He offered the roses. "A token. No bride should go without flowers forever." Jessamine looked at the blossoms. Their color reminded her of wax seals and fresh wounds. "My wedding gift was enough." Pike smiled. "Ah, yes, papers in a box. A man gives land to a woman only when he knows he cannot keep it." Marshall's voice was quiet. "Say what you came to say." Pike turned so the nearest townsfolk could hear. "Only that a deed obtained through pressure might be challenged. Your husband forced a transaction on me with threats. You took his payment," Jessamine said. "And now I question the circumstances." "You would question sunrise if it cost you land," the crowd murmured again. But Pike's smile returned. "Careful, Jessamine. Fire has visited your family once. It might visit paper too." Marshall moved then. Not much. One step. Enough that Pike's hand twitched near his coat. "No threats near my wife," Marshall said. Pike's gaze slid between them, measuring something. "Wife? That word sits strange, doesn't it? Considering she has a paper in a box ready to undo it." The insult landed where Pike meant it to land. Jessamine felt the town hear it. Marshall did not deny. That hurt before she could stop it from hurting. Inside the church, the sermon was on charity. Reverend Bell's voice cracked twice. Jessamine heard almost none of it. She sat beside Marshall, feeling the space between their shoulders, small as a handspan and wide as a river. After service, Mrs. Vale stopped her near the door. "I suppose you are pleased," the woman said. "Some women get courted. Some get purchased and pretend the receipt is romance." Jessamine's face burned. Marshall heard. So did half the church. He turned. "Mrs. Vale, another word, and you will apologize from the church steps." The woman drew herself up. "You would shame a widow." "No. I would ask one to remember. She is speaking to a woman who has been shamed enough." Jessamine could not look at him. Not because he had embarrassed her, but because he had not. That afternoon, snow thickened. The ride home grew difficult, the wagon wheels cutting through mud beneath white crust. Halfway to the ranch, Marshall turned toward a line of blackened cottonwoods instead of the north road. "Where are we going?" Jessamine asked. "Your place." Her place. The Denton homestead waited under snow and silence. The old house was a charred skeleton, beams like black ribs against the sky. Beyond it, near the springhouse, stood the new cabin Marshall had built. Its raw pine walls glowed pale in the dim light. A door hung straight on iron hinges. The brass key in Jessamine's pocket suddenly felt alive. She climbed down without help and walked first to the burned ruin. "I was in town the day it happened," she said. "Father had gone to fetch medicine. When we came back, the roof was gone. Mother's quilts, her table, the cradle he made before I was born, all gone." Marshall stood behind her, hat in his hand despite the cold. "Folks said lightning," she continued. "There was no storm that day." Jessamine turned. Marshall looked toward the black beams. "I looked into it after your father died. A man of Pike's was seen riding from here at dusk. Your father had found something in the old land records. Something Pike wanted buried." "What records?" Marshall took a folded oilskin packet from his coat. "I found this in the courthouse copy room. Your father filed a notice before the fire. The Denton Spring is the original water source for 3 parcels, Pike claims. If proved, he loses control of the East Range." Jessamine's hands shook as she opened the packet. Her father's signature stared up from the paper, familiar and heartbreaking. He knew he was trying to save the land. "Then, why didn't anyone help him?" Marshall's expression closed. "Because men like Pike make fear look like wisdom," he said. Jessamine looked at the burned home, then at the new cabin. "And you? Why did you help me before you knew me?" He was silent for a long moment. "My sister's name was Clara," he said. "She was 17 when our father signed her to a marriage contract over a debt. I was 20 and had nothing but anger. Her husband wore a good coat in church and locked every door in his house after. She wrote me 3 letters. The last one said, 'I am still here, but I am not,'" Snow whispered over the black beams. "I got there too late," Marshall said. "She was buried under his name." No one spoke of force. They spoke of duty. Jessamine stepped closer, slowly. "That is why you put the deed in my name." Yes. "And the annulment." Yes. "So I would have a door." He looked at her then, and the grief in him was no longer distant or hard. It was raw country after fire. "So you would have every door I could give you," he said. The wind moved between them. Jessamine wanted to touch his sleeve as she had outside the mercantile, but this moment was too fragile for pretending it meant little. Instead, she walked to the new cabin door and took out the brass key. The lock turned. Inside smelled of pine, cold ashes, and beginning. There was a small stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a quilt folded on a narrow bed. On the wall, Marshall had hung a carved piece of wood saved from the old house. Jessamine recognized the mark at once. Her father had carved a little sunburst near the kitchen door when she was small because she had been afraid of the dark. Her breath broke. Marshall remained outside the threshold. "I thought you might want that kept." Jessamine pressed her fingers to the sunburst. For the first time since the forced vows, she cried where Marshall could see. He did not move to claim comfort from her tears. He stood in the open doorway with snow on his shoulders, guarding the quiet while she grieved. That restraint, more than any embrace, reached her. The public choice came 3 days before Christmas, when Clayton Pike tried to sell the Denton land on the courthouse steps. He chose noon, when the town would be gathered for market, and no one could pretend not to see. A red auction flag hung from the rail. Sheriff Tate stood nearby, looking unhappy but lawful. Reverend Bell hovered beside him. Mrs. Vale and the ladies' aide watched from beneath fur-trimmed bonnets, their faces pinched with cold and curiosity. Jessamine arrived in the Irons wagon with Marshall beside her, and the cedar box held in both hands. She had not slept. The night before, A rider had thrown a stone through the kitchen window at the Irons ranch. Around it was tied a note, "Bring the deed or lose the man." Marshall had read it once, then put it in the stove. Jessamine had seen blood on his knuckles from where the glass cut him, and fear had moved through her like winter water. Not fear of Pike. Fear that Marshall would decide her land had brought too much trouble and quietly sent her away for safety. Instead, he had wrapped his hand, saddled 2 horses, and ridden fence until dawn to make sure no fire had been set. At breakfast, he said, "You do not have to stand in town today." Jessamine looked at the cedar box on the table. "I was forced to stand once. Today, I choose it." Now, on the courthouse steps, Pike lifted a paper high. "By claim of irregular transfer and unresolved lien, this parcel will be offered for bidding until the circuit judge rules permanent title." Marshall's voice carried over the crowd. "There is no unresolved lien." Pike smiled. "Then, you will not fear proceedings." Jessamine stepped forward before Marshall could. "Read the parcel name." Pike's eyes flickered. "Read it," she said. The sheriff took the paper and cleared his throat. "Denton East Homestead Parcel, Springhouse Lot, Orchard Ground." "In whose name?" Jessamine asked. The sheriff glanced at Pike, then at the paper. "Jessamine Denton." A murmur spread. Not Mrs. Irons, not Marshall's wife. Jessamine Denton. Jessamine opened the cedar box. The same box that had stunned the church now stunned the town again. But this time, her hands did not tremble. She took out the debt receipt, the deed, the key, and the annulment petition. Last, she took out her father's land notice. "My father was called foolish," she said, "then unlucky, then dead. I was called burden, poor relation, desperate bride, purchased woman." Mr. Pike counted on all those words being heavier than paper. Pike laughed. "Careful with speeches. They do not change law, no," Jessamine said. "But truth changes witnesses." She held up the land notice. "My father found that the Denton spring feeds the East Range. Mr. By tried to take the land through debt. When that failed, the homestead burned. When I was left alone, he tried to force me into service. When Marshall Irons paid the debt and gave the land back to me, Mr. Pike called it theft." He let her voice be the one that filled the street. Pike's face had gone pale beneath its weathered color. "You have no proof of fire," a voice came from the edge of the crowd. "I do." Amos Creed limped forward, hat in hand. He looked older in town daylight than he did by barn lantern. Pike stared. "You keep quiet, old man." Amos stopped beside Jessamine. I kept quiet 9 years too long. Saw Bram Pike ride from Denton, place the evening it burned. Saw smoke before dark. Told myself it was not my fight. Then Miss Clara Irons died after folks said the same thing about her pain. Marshall's face changed at his sister's name. Amos looked at him. "Should we've told you long ago, son." The town was silent but for horses stamping. Pike's hand went to his coat. Marshall moved faster than thought, stepping between Pike and Jessamine. Sheriff Tate drew his pistol. "Do not," the sheriff said. For one breath, it seemed the whole town balanced on the edge of violence. Then Pike dropped his hand. Reverend Bell climbed the first step, his face gray with shame. "This auction cannot proceed." Pike whirled on him. "You have no authority." "No," the Reverend said, "but I have a conscience, late as it is." Mrs. Vale made a small sound, half shock and half offense. Jessamine turned to Marshall. In front of everyone, she saw the cut on his hand bleeding through the bandage. He had protected her land, her name, her voice, but he had not once asked her to choose him in return. That was when she understood what love was becoming inside her. Not thunder, not a wedding kiss, not a cage warmed by kindness. It was the steady sight of a man, leaving every door open and standing guard anyway. She lifted the annulment petition. The crowd leaned in. "This paper was Marshall Irons' wedding gift to me," she said. "A way out after winter. Some of you mocked it. Some called it proof we were not husband and wife, but I know now what it was." She tore the paper once, Marshall went still. She tore it again, slowly, in front of Pike, Reverend Bell, Mrs. Vale, the sheriff, and every soul who had watched her forced down a church aisle. "It was the first respectful thing any man offered me," she said. "And because I was given the freedom to leave, I can stand here free and say I choose to stay." Marshall's eyes held hers, unguarded for the first time. "Jessamine," he said softly. She stepped down from the courthouse stair and stood beside him. "Not because debt chose, not because fear chose, not because church papers chose. I choose. Touching, but sentiment won't mend your cabin when fire comes again." Marshall's voice dropped. "You threaten fire once more and I will see you in chains." The sheriff nodded to his deputy. "Clayton Pike, you'll come with me until the judge hears sworn statements." Pike looked around for allies and found only lowered eyes. As the deputy took his arm, Jessamine saw Mrs. Vale staring at the torn annulment paper in the snow. The woman's mouth opened, but no words came. Marshall bent and picked up the pieces. For a terrible second, Jessamine feared she had hurt him by tearing what he had meant as protection. Instead, he folded the scraps and placed them back in the cedar box. "For memory?" she asked. "For proof," he said. "Of what?" His scarred hand closed gently over the lid. "That you were never mine because you had no choice." Spring came late to Mercy Creek, but when it came with hammer song. The Denton homestead rose again under a wide blue sky. Men who had once looked away now lifted beams. Women who had once whispered now brought bread, beans, jars of peaches, and bolts of cloth. No one called it charity. Jessamine would not have accepted it if they had. Reverend Bell called it restitution from the church purse, from town donations, and from fines levied after Clayton Pike's fraud was entered into record by the circuit judge. Pike did not hang. Frontier justice was rarely as clean as stories wished, but he lost the disputed water rights, paid damages, and was taken east under guard after Amos and 2 others gave sworn testimony. His ranch broke apart before summer. Men who had feared him discovered that fear had been the fence holding his empire together. Marshall's North Range survived the winter. The Irons house changed too. Curtains stayed open. Cinnamon became a common extravagance. The blue shawl moved wherever Jessamine moved, sometimes around her shoulders, sometimes across the back of Marshall's chair. When evenings turned cool, she did not move into the Denton cabin when it was finished. Not at first. Marshall never asked why. He kept the brass key on the kitchen shelf beside the cedar box and let the question live there without pressure. That was his way. He could face down a rancher in the street, but would not crowd a woman's heart by an inch. One April morning, Jessamine found him at the barn, repairing a harness with one hand still stiff from the winter cut. "You stitch leather badly," she said. He glanced up. "I was waiting for expert criticism." She took the strap and sat beside him on an overturned crate. Their shoulders touched. Neither moved away. "The judge's letter came," she said. Marshall went quiet. The judge had confirmed the marriage lawful and the property transfer valid. He had also written that if Jessamine wished to pursue annulment on grounds of coercion, the court would hear her petition despite the torn paper. Reverend Bell had brought the letter personally, hat crushed in both hands. "I helped a wrong thing wear a holy coat," the preacher had told her on the porch. "I am sorry, Mrs. Irons. More than I know how to say." Jessamine had accepted the apology, not because it erased anything, but because refusing it would tie her forever to the day she was forced. Now Marshall looked at the harness in her hands. "What did you decide?" Jessamine threaded the needle. "I decided I disliked being called Mrs. Irons by people who once used it as gossip." His face closed with careful restraint. "You can be Jessamine Denton before the court. I know. You can have the cabin, the land. I won't contest a thing. I know that too." A swallow dipped through the barn door and vanished into the rafters. Jessamine set the harness aside. "I also decided I like hearing you say my name, Marshall did not move. Hope came into his face slowly, as if he distrusted it. I am not asking from gratitude, she said. I am not staying because I fear the world. I am not mistaking rescue for love. His voice was rough. Then, what are you doing? Choosing the man who gave me a door and never blocked it. Outside, Amos shouted at a mule. The mule ignored him with dignity. Marshall laughed under his breath, but his eyes shone. I would court you proper, he said, if you let me. I made a poor start of it. You made a terrible start of it. Yes, ma'am. But you might continue. He looked down, smiling like a man stepping into sunlight after years indoors. Their second wedding took place in June, though Reverend Bell called it a renewal of vows and Jessamine called it a correction. It was held not inside the church, but at the Denton homestead, beneath the young apple trees that had somehow survived fire, neglect, and winter. Their blossoms came late, small and stubborn. Jessamine wore a cream dress sewn by her own hands. The boots Marshall had bought her were polished, but worn now, shaped to her feet by work and weather. Around her wrist was the faded blue ribbon from her mother's hymn book. Marshall stood beneath the trees in a clean shirt that Amos claimed made him look suspicious. He had shaved badly along the jaw and kept touching his coat pocket, as if afraid the ring might escape. The town came. Not all, but enough. Mrs. Vale arrived last, carrying a quilt folded over her arms. She stopped before Jessamine, pride and shame wrestling across her face. I spoke cruelly, she said. Often, Jessamine waited. Mrs. Vale swallowed. I am sorry. The quilt was made of blue, gray, and gold pieces. Some scraps Jessamine recognized from church dresses, some from flour sacks, some from cloth she had never seen. It is not payment, Mrs. Vale said. It is apology with stitches. Jessamine touched the quilt. Then I accept the stitches. The rest will take time. Mrs. Vale nodded, eyes wet. Time then. That was the way healing came to Mercy Creek. Not in one speech, not in one arrest, but in return names, repaired doors, and apologies that had to keep living after they were spoken. When Reverend Bell began, Jessamine did not feel a hand pressing into her back. No aunt pushed her forward. No debt waited behind the vows. No rival watched from the front pew with victory in his mouth. Marshall took her hands. Jessamine Denton, he said, voice carrying beneath the apple trees. The first time I stood beside you, I gave you papers because papers were all I knew how to trust. Today I have no debt receipt, no deed, no petition. Only my name, my house, my work, and the years left in me. I offer them freely. Jessamine's throat tightened. I accept freely, she said, and I offer mine the same. He placed a plain gold ring on her finger. Then, after the vows, he reached for the cedar box. A stir moved through the gathering. Everyone remembered the first wedding gift, the church silence, the papers, the stunned faces. Clayton Pike rising in fury. Jessamine standing in a gray dress with a cracked shoe, and no way to know whether the stranger beside her was another cage. Marshall opened the box. Inside lay the old torn annulment paper, the debt receipt, the deed, the brass key, and something new, a carved wooden sign, small enough to hold in two hands. He turned it so all could see. Denton Irons, home built by freedom, kept by choice. No one spoke. Then Amos blew his nose loudly into a handkerchief and ruined the silence in the best possible way. Laughter broke gently across the yard. Jessamine pressed both hands over her mouth, but the tears came anyway. Marshall looked uncertain for half a second, as if even now he feared giving wrong. She took the sign from him. This, she said, is a fine wedding gift. He leaned close enough that only she heard his answer. Better than legal papers. Much better. Better than boots. She glanced down at her polished, worn boots. Do not grow proud. He smiled. Later, they hung the sign above the cabin door. The crowd shared supper in the yard as lanterns were lit, and the first stars came over the prairie. Children chased each other between wagon wheels. Reverend Bell helped Amos carry benches. Mrs. Vale served coffee without once correcting how anyone held a cup. Jessamine stood at the edge of the orchard, watching lamplight spill from the cabin Marshall had built when she was still a stranger to him. The burned beams were gone now, but one piece remained inside. Her father's carved sunburst above the kitchen door. Marshall came to stand beside her. "Tired?" he asked. "Yes, happy." She looked at the house, the people, the land, then at the man who had first come into her life as a stranger at an altar and slowly become the safest place she knew. "Yes," she said, "but not the loud kind." He nodded. "The lasting kind, maybe." The prairie wind moved through the apple leaves. Somewhere beyond the barn, a horse nickered. From the open cabin door came the smell of coffee, cinnamon, warm bread, and new wood. Jessamine slipped her hand into Marshall's. On the day they were forced to marry, his wedding gift had stunned the town because it gave her freedom. On the day they chose each other, his gift stunned her heart because it asked for nothing except a life built honestly, one morning at a time. The dust rose golden in the evening light, then settled around them like peace.